Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. The fires in the Amazon have become a political mess, with the president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, going back and forth on his stance of whether Brazil has enough resources to deal with the matter, and the French president, Emmanuel Macron, leading and pressurizing the South American country to take strict actions. Now, in all of this, a conversation is to be had regarding the role and power of climate diplomacy today. We take a closer look at whether the state of diplomacy today is more or less a reflection of inequality and political divisions. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Mark, an analyst and professor at State University of New York Maritime College, joining us from New York. We're also joined by Mr. Guy Burton, an international relations expert, joining us from Brussels. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Meirowtiz, I'd like to begin with you. Now, let's move back a little and talk about Jair Bolsonaro's stance that has been so far. Now, before he said he did not have enough resources to fight the fire, then he deployed almost 44,000 troops to fight the fire, and then he rejected the money that was being given to him by the G7 countries. And now he's saying that he will accept the money, but on certain conditions. Now, what do you make out of this?
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And if I may say personally, he's destroying his own country. He has a personal dispute with Emmanuel Macron. It's a personal dispute of references to Macron's wife that Bolsonaro had made. And also the terminology of Bolsonaro sounds very Trumpian. He talks about fake news and false news. He wants to position himself as the Trump of Brazil. And this is not effective because what he needs to do is to be nice and friendly with everybody so he can get the aid and assistance he needs. If he doesn't do that, he's going to destroy his country, and Brazil is going to become another Venezuela. And I think that he needs to stop this personal intervention and start negotiating like a world leader and try to protect his people and the resources of his country. So I think, this isn't really about politics. It's very personal and it's very Trump-like. So not effective for the country.
Right, Mr. Meirowtiz, that's a very interesting point. It's very Trump-like, and it won't work for Brazil. But for the United States, it does seem that it's working. Now, in this age where Trump has created this new form of diplomacy and other world leaders are following suit, does this show that for some countries, using force, using this sort of language works and goes, and for some countries it won't?
I think it's the difference between, nationalism and global multiculturalism. It's very simple. And Trump's approach is very America first. So I think that Bolsonaro is Brazil first. But you notice that the United States has actually agreed to provide assistance to Brazil to help it fight the fires, also Israel. So, it's kind of this bilateral thing where it's, again, to go back to Trump, Bolsonaro is following Trump. He makes a deal. He made a deal with the U.S. He made a deal with the other one. The people he likes, he makes deals with. And the people he doesn't like, he doesn't work with. And that just doesn't really work when you have a tremendous issue affecting the future of your country.
Right. Now, I'm going to bring Mr. Burton into this conversation as well. And Mr. Burton, while we're talking about this Trump-like diplomacy and the fact that Trump also agreed to provide some money to Brazil in terms of fighting the Amazon fires. Now, it's also important to remember Trump's own stance when it comes to climate change. He did not attend the climate change meeting during the G7 summit. He also gave out a very harsh statement later on when he says that he does not want to risk the development of the United States for all this talk of all these ideals about climate change. Now, what happens and what do you take this Trump's gesture of contributing to the Amazon fight as when he's saying that I'll contribute to and help you fight the fires?
Well, thank you for inviting me on. I mean, I would say one of the big problems that we face is that all of this discussion about providing aid to help fight the fires in the Amazon only is going to tackle the fires themselves. And actually, it won't talk about the policies that have led to this. Bolsonaro is very much like Trump in being a climate change skeptic. When he got elected last year, he talked about loosening and lightening the regulation to allow ranchers and farmers and agribusiness to develop the Amazon further. So what we're seeing with these wildfires, it's not simply accidental. I mean, a lot of this is down to policies that the government is actually putting forward. So if you're talking about wanting to sort of stop these fires, it's not just enough to put them out. The question is, what are you going to do to actually prevent this from happening in the first place? There's also, I guess, with that, a bigger discussion, which is that the Amazon, the fate of the Amazon is not solely a Brazilian issue. I mean, I know that that Bolsonaro and the nationalists in Brazil are talking about this as a national sovereignty issue, but the fate of the Amazon is actually an existential one. It has repercussions not just for people in Brazil, but globally. And actually, what we don't have is an ability to be able to solve these kind of transnational global problems relating to climate change generally.
Mr. Burton, as you rightly mentioned, that is a global issue, given that the Amazon is seen as the green lungs of the planet. It produces almost 20% of the oxygen in the entire world. But also with that, if we try to unpack Bolsonaro's argument, which is about sovereignty, I think any nation in the world would use that argument. And we do have countries, powerful developed nations, that are contributing consistently to fossil fuel emissions. And it seems like they're not being targeted in the same way right now as Brazil is. So isn't there a double standard there?
Yeah, and this is actually one of the big challenges that's always been central to the debate and discussion about how do we resolve climate change, how do we deal with greenhouse gas emissions? Because generally what the developing countries of the world have said is that they have tended to be on the receiving end of this. So countries like China would say, look, we didn't emit most of the greenhouse gases that now pollute the planet. This was actually initially the result of the countries that are now industrialized. I mean, I guess it's which side of the fence you want to sit on is a moot point. But the real question is, how do we move forward? Whether it's done historically or whether it's done today, we do need to find a solution, do need to find a way forward on how to actually resolve this problem.
Right. And I do want to talk a little more about that. How do we move towards a solution when there is a very strong moral argument to be made that don't hinder the development of developing economies, because they need it now. If developed economies have gotten through that and they have contributed their fair share of emissions, why hold developing nations to account there? We'll unpack that in a bit. But before that, I'd also like to introduce another guest, Ms. Claudia Astarita, political analyst joining us from Paris. Thank you so much, Claudia, for joining us. Now, while we're working through climate diplomacy and talking about the G7 summit, President Emmanuel Macron played a key role through it. And he is being seen as a green leader. He's being seen at the forefront of this fight. But before the summit, there were several protests throughout France. And tell us what those protests were about and what is the on-ground image of Macron right now?
I think what the Macron is trying to show is that we really need to be active in terms of reacting to climate change, because it is a major issue and because we need to be to find a way to put Europe together under a plan that can achieve some consistent results. So the idea of Macron, I think, is one of the more stable and strong leaders we have in Europe. That's why he's taking the lead of this fight.
Right.
And
why were there thousands of protesters on the streets on the 24th of August, right before the G7 summit?
Because the idea is that this is not the main priority at the moment. So the protests are there mainly because people do not agree that we need to be so active from the perspective of climate change. That's the point. But they were mainly related to other internal issues in France more than to a position that is against the fight of climate change.
Right.
So it's...
Right. So, Mr. Meirowtiz, I'm going to go to you with this. Now, there is internal pressure in some states that say that this shouldn't be the priority. And in other states where there are right-wing governments, there is pressure being put on by the people on these governments to take a more strict action. In all of this, I want to figure out what the role of corporations is, multinational corporations. Are they trying to become more environmentally friendly with everything that's unfolding? Are they trying to stick with the right-wing governments in order to continuously maximize their own profits?
Well, I want to go back to the other commentators, because first of all, this point about developing versus developed world, I don't think this is a real issue. I mean, I want to be very candid about it, especially with Brazil, because these are made fires. And furthermore, I wanted to point out that this is not a climate change issue. This is an issue of having people setting fires. So let's put the fires out. As far as climate change is concerned, we know that President Trump does not agree with climate change. Boris Johnson wants a deal with President Trump. So this is a no-starter. And as far as Europe is concerned...
But Mr. Meirowtiz, why do you believe that this is not an issue, the developed versus developing nations theory, and the fact that different standards should be applied? Don't you think that developing nations are justified when they say that we want to move towards development to get towards these developed nations or to close the gap in inequality?
Yes, this is an old issue that's going back years and years and years, and the developing world wants to be able to do things the developed world doesn't want them to do it. And if you look at Bolsonaro's Facebook page, which is sort of like a clone of Trump's Twitter page, he talks about colonization and all these issues. These are bogus issues, in my opinion.
Why?
And I don't think
why are they bogus?
I don't think they're valid because there's nothing being colonized here. What's happening here is that the leader of this country is destroying his own country. And this has nothing to do with colonization of any kind. And he actually reached out to the main country in the developed world, which is the United States, to help him out, which shows really, if I may say, a bit of hypocrisy on his part. So in other words, why doesn't he just help to put out the problem, and then the world can try to address this issue? But as so long as Trump is president, the United States, I don't think, is going to be on board to deal with this issue. How about right-wing governments? That's the tendency today in Europe. And you see Bolsonaro, and you see the European right-wing countries. They're all trying to emulate Trump and get Trump's support. So that's the reality. And I don't think it's easy to just go ahead and try to, avoid the reality.
I take your point there, Mr. Meirowtiz. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about this. Mr. Burton, going on and talking a little more about what Mr. Meirowtiz was pointing out here, that these are bogus claims or bogus issues. Now, for these countries who are taking in aid, Brazil, for instance, and having this fear that after this, their policies will be dictated by other countries, have they also been so in the past as well? Do you think that this is a bogus claim?
I mean, I guess what would be... It's interesting to look at. Initially, Bolsonaro rejected the G7 sort of pitch, the 20 million that was proposed there. And as your previous commentator said, obviously there's sort of no love lost between Bolsonaro and Macron on this. But both the British and the Canadians have also offered funds to Brazil to help with the wildfires. Again, they haven't made any kind of specific demands in terms of changes to policy. And at the same time, within the Brazilian press, it's very interesting to see that they are emphasizing that we will accept this money on the understanding that we decide how to use it. So, this issue of sort of national sovereignty, I mean, we can debate, whether there really is colonialism or not going on here. But I think what's happening is probably Bolsonaro and the people around him are playing to their base. And there is, within Brazil, sort of a strong sort of historical legacy of seeing themselves as part of the developing world, of challenging that notion of the global north. But what is interesting also to point out about Brazilian foreign policy, in the past, it has always tended to try and be relatively independent. What is striking about the Bolsonaro government is it is made very much aligning itself towards Trump, which may work in the short term. But if Trump is out of office at the end of next year, that's going to create problems for Bolsonaro.
Right. Claudia, I'm going to take this point to you, that if Trump is out of office, it's going to create problems for Bolsonaro. But throughout the world, we are seeing the rise in the right wing. So do you think that all these leaders are going to create their defense even stronger against climate change, and they're going to work against hindering it? I mean, we're already seeing it in place. But do you think in the future this is just going to get stronger?
So I think there are 2 points that need to be emphasized. First of all, it's true. There are more and more countries that are trying to get Trump support. And this is dangerous because this creates lots of propaganda, nationalist propaganda inside those countries. But we need to understand that the United States will do, and Trump in particular, will do exactly what he wants. So the fact that they can feel closer to Trump on one issue, such as this one on the Amazon, and we have seen Trump leaving the meeting that were discussing the Amazon issues at the G7 because he didn't want to be involved with that. So doesn't mean that they will continue to have Trump support forever. So no matter what will happen to Trump, they will be in trouble as soon as they will have issues or difficulty with the United States on other issues. At the same time, I think it's very dangerous that these dynamics are very, very dangerous because the real problem is that when we see what Bolsonaro is doing in countries such as Italy or other countries in Europe that have right-wing governments, this creates the habit or the expectation that they could actually raise similar points, similar issues in the same way. And this reduces the support that we need to find to fight climate changes, to find other global challenges that are very urgent. And this is, I think, very, very dangerous.
All right, Claudia, hold on to that point. I want to introduce another guest who's joined us, Steve Keen, economist and the author of Debunking Economics, joining us from Amsterdam. Thank you so much, Mr. Keen, for joining us. Now, we're talking about climate diplomacy, and we're talking about inequality being reflected in it. Now, pressurizing certain countries more than others to take climate-friendly action to do what's right, but letting other countries go. How does this play into the larger system?
Well, I just think the inequality is one of the major reasons we have the massive level of climate change that's occurring, because, of course, most of that climate change, whether the resources are generated in the third world or not, they're consumed in the first world, and that's what's causing the overload. Even in Brazil, a lot of the destruction of the Amazon forest is because it's being used for producing agribusiness products to export to the West. But at the same time, we've now got to the level where this is such a critical problem for the planet that we can't allow rogue behaviour, and yet two of the major rogue economies, not just Brazil, but also the United States.
Right. And as you mentioned here, the products that are produced in the Amazon are actually exported to the West. Now, trying to protect the Amazon, would that also require reworking the trade system?
Yeah, I mean, we have an enormously globalized economy, and of course a large part of the carbon emissions are produced by the ships that are shipping those goods from one country to another. I think we're going to find, and very rapidly in the next decade, maybe 2 decades, that we can no longer afford the damage that is doing to the biosphere, and we're going to go back to a more domestically based production system, which means basically dismantling everything that globalization has been based upon.
Right. And Mr. Burton, while we're talking about this, do you think real policies will be taken in order to do this, in order to reduce these emissions, in order to move from this globalized system and move towards more localized productions?
I mean, one of the big challenges one of the issues associated with what's going on at the moment, I'm sure you're probably aware that about 2 months ago, the European Union and Mercosur, the common market of South America, which includes Brazil and a couple of the neighboring countries, issued a trade deal in principle. I mean, the details of that will not come out until the end of next year. But already there's sort of issues surrounding that, because obviously, the free trade deal is to reduce tariffs, to encourage more free trade. So on the Brazilian side, that would mean, more the export of more meat, which, as your previous commentator said, is a result of sort of the deforestation of the Amazon. This has not really been addressed, and a number of environmental NGOs have been talking about this proposed trade arrangement as actually sort of being detrimental to the Amazon and detrimental to the environment. Unless that is addressed within sort of the detail of it, it's very hard to see, as you say, improvements in policy.
Right. Claudia, what is your take to all that has been stated in terms of trade, the agreements that are being made there, and the fact of moving goods from one country to the other, fewer tariffs, but also increasing the environmental costs of it?
Definitely. I mean, this is very urgent. The problem is that we don't have an agreement on that. So, and I think, unfortunately, that it will take years and lots of negotiation to find an agreement between a reasonable number of countries. And what I hope is that it won't be too late. And I think this is the reason why a leader like Macron is trying to put a lot of emphasis, and Trudeau is doing the same, put a lot of emphasis on the urgency on finding real solution. But to be honest, I think that we are very far away from it.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Ms. Claudia Astarita, for joining us. Mr. Keane, now going back to Brazil and talking a little more about how its economy and development is reliant on the Amazon and the deforestation of it. Now, to try to untangle this web, the fact that there is a lot of catastrophe happening there, but also at the same hand, development is happening. Do you think Brazil can go on without the deforestation and move towards development in the same way if they don't cause that much damage to the Amazon?
I think there's no longer any possibility of balancing growth on the one hand with ecological sustainability on the other. We've gone well past the point of both. We have to go drastically backwards in our energy consumption, and that means that development and growth are no longer feasible at the same time. One of my colleagues, Tim Garrett, has made this point very well in a paper called No Way Out, which basically says that we simply cannot marry the two together now. If we'd started doing this 50 years ago, then we could have tapered towards a situation of both development and ecological sustainability. Fundamentally because academic economists, particularly William Nordhaus, have delayed action on climate change for the last half century, it's not possible to do that any longer.
Right. So now, as you said, you mentioned this article called No Way Out. Now, what can be expected in terms of what will happen in the future? I mean, we're talking about what needs to happen on an urgent basis, but as you're saying, it seems very unlikely that we can have sustain the environment along with sustaining the same course of development.
That's the real problem. I mean, again, sensible scientists like Will Steffen and Tim Lenton have now argued that we are already probably passing tipping points in crucial components of the biosphere, such as the Arctic ice, then Greenland, then the tundra exploding quite literally. We simply have to go backwards in terms of our energy consumption. And what's likely to happen is, of course, it won't be done by any agreement. It'll be done in a compulsory fashion. I think we're going to see rogue attempts at geoengineering to reduce the level of sunlight coming onto the planet. That's something any country could take on. Any country the size of Pakistan or larger could consider doing that. And I see us having a serious breakdown in the economic and production systems of the economy as the climate really starts to bite, with failures of fish stocks, failures of monsoons, all these sorts of effects coming in a very uncontrolled way. Right.
Mr. Burton, now talk a little more about diplomacy and taking the G7 in focus and talking a little about what came out of that meeting. Now, what is the state of diplomacy now? When we're talking about these large issues, global issues, there seems to be no way to even come to the table and come to an agreement. Do you see that the G7 summit was a reflection of this?
I mean, one of the things that has been said about the G7, especially despite the positive reviews of at least Macron's management of the process, and there's also been a more critical view of G7, which is that what exactly was it all for? It brought together these various leaders, but they decided against doing a communiqué, simply based on the experience they had last year when Trump flounced out. This year, they decided not to do that. And in the end, it ended up being a number of bilateral meetings, which could really happen anywhere else. So the question really is, what is the purpose of the G7 for?
Right. And Mr. Keane, on that note, what is the purpose of the G7 if they really can't do what they're meant to do? Also, another argument is to be made, why should these countries be leading in these diplomatic measures in relation to the entire world? Do you think to move towards a more equal system, whether we talk about climate or economics, there needs to be more involvement of other countries?
Well, the G7 is a relic of the days in which Europe and America dominated the global economy. Now, I mean, if you call it the G7 and say what are the 7 largest economies, that should include India, China and Russia. Now, they're not in there. And it's really political decisions. There's inertia in the political system, which is the reason why the G7 has still got these fossils, including, of course, the United Kingdom. So, yes, it should be more broadly based. And at the same time, there should be some capacity to make decisions stick. And to some extent, telling Brazil that they may face trade sanctions if they don't stop the damage to the Amazon. I think that's the sort of future we're going to see, regardless of whether it's the G7 or the G20 or any larger organization.
But would the same sanctions be applied to more developed nations? That's the question that I asked in the start as well. I mean, we know that the largest fossil fuel emitters are the United States, the European Union. They wouldn't face the same sanctions as we're talking about Brazil here. So in the end, aren't we back to square one where some countries are being penalized, but they're not even the main problem there?
Yeah, this is the real dilemma. I mean, the great problem of global warming and the one part of the conventional economic theory I'll give some credit to is that this is what's a classic case of what they call the tragedy of the commons. Because the damage is felt globally, but the emitters are local, there's no constraint on that local behaviour until the global system starts to break down. Once it does, of course, it's too late to do anything on a local scale.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Keen, for joining us from Amsterdam, and thank you so much, Mr. Gert Burton, for joining us from Brussels. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, in a landmark decision, an Oklahoma court has ruled in the first judgment of its kind against the powerful drug industry. Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company, has been fined $572 million for its role in the opioid crisis in the state. The company has been found guilty in downplaying the harm of opioid prescription drugs, which contributed in exacerbating the health crisis in Oklahoma. Similar cases are pending in 40 other U.S. states, and this ruling is being seen as setting a precedent. On today's show, we take a closer look at the use of opioids and how much influence do pharmaceutical companies have in increasing opioid addiction. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Sonya Saleem, general physician, joining us from London. We're also joined by Professor Atholl Johnston, Professor of Clinical Pharmacology at the Queen Mary University, London. He's also joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Dr. Saleem, I'd like to begin with you. Now, take us through what this addiction is, opioid addiction, and how do prescription drugs play a role in this?
Okay, so opioids are a very specific group of medications. They are used for a variety of things, and most notably for controlling pain. So we have our very strong opioids such as morphine, tramadol, and we have slightly weaker opioids such as cocodamol, which actually in the UK you can buy over the counter. So there's a huge array to choose from. They are good in the sense that they can be used for certain types of patients, for example, cancer patients that are nearing the end of life. It's especially good for helping to reduce pain and also for helping to reduce distressing symptoms such as breathing. But the problem tends to arise when people are started on opioids inappropriately. So the WHO has a pain ladder, and according to the WHO pain ladder, we are supposed to be starting on with less strong forms of analgesias. So for example, regular paracetamol. Then the next stage is to add in a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. If despite those two medications, the pain is still there, then we move on to opioids. Now, the reason they're at the very last or the very end step of the ladder is because they are potentially very, very harmful. They have a very narrow therapeutic index. And although I said they're very good in terms of helping patients, especially those nearing the end of life and for cancer pain patients, they are incredibly addictive. So if somebody is prescribed too much of an opioid, and its frequency is very regular for a sustained, frequent amount of time, then there's a risk of dependency. So essentially, that patient has the urge to keep asking for the opioid. Then if they don't have the opioid, they will get withdrawal symptoms, which are incredibly distressing. And in order to alleviate those withdrawal symptoms, they then need to seek out more of the medication. So over time, they tend to develop a tolerance, and hence forming the addictive nature of such medications. And obviously, if sometimes patients have too much of this, it's going to ultimately lead to respiratory depression and ultimately death.
Right. And Dr. Saleem, that was a very thorough description of what actually happens and how these drugs lead to addiction. Professor Johnston, now we hear a lot about the statistics coming out of the United States, but painting a global picture of this and the fact that their use seems to be ubiquitous. How much of an addiction on a global scale is happening right now?
Well, I mean, you say the statistics are a problem, but if you actually look at the statistics, there has been an increase in drug deaths starting in, from when the statistics started to be gathered in 1999. Though in the US, for example, it was about 6 people in 100,000 would die of opiate overdose. And that has gradually increased, and now it's about 18 per 100,000 who are dying. It's not something that's happened overnight. This has taken a 15-year period or nearly 20-year period to actually develop. So to say it's to do with Johnson & Johnson or Purdue as being the pharmaceutical companies promoting this, I'm not sure that's actually the case.
Right.
Obviously, pharmaceutical companies have got a responsibility to promote their drugs responsibly and safely. But we have other people who play in this, and that's the regulators, for example, because drug advertising is regulated. We've heard Dr. Saleem, and she says quite rightly that doctors have to be careful when they're prescribing these drugs and be mindful that the patients may end up getting too much. And of course, the patients themselves have got a role in this.
Now, Professor Johnston, following from this, you've mentioned how this was a gradual increase. It didn't happen overnight. And to attribute this to these drug companies might not be quite right. But we also know that these pharmaceutical companies have a lot of influence. And to try to understand that better, take us through it. How can these drug companies influence health and policymakers? And how can they influence doctors and their practices?
Well, obviously, they're trying to make money. I mean, that's their purpose. That's what drug companies are there. If they don't make money, they don't make product, and that's an issue.
Right.
They promote the drugs to doctors and to encourage them to use them. And in this case, it sounds like they're being said that Johnson & Johnson downplayed the addictive nature of these. I unfortunately have not seen any of the advertising materials. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's difficult quite to believe that is the case, because we all know that opiates are addictive. And
Right.
We've known this for a long time.
Right. Dr. Saleem, going to the case in which they were found guilty. Now, what they were found guilty for was that they were downplaying the harmfulness of these drugs and the fact that they were so widespread and available, and saying that they're not as harmful as they might be. Now, in that, how much of that of a practice do we see all across, and especially even in the UK, where drug companies downplay the effects of their products?
I mean, as the professor said, these drug companies are, they're orientated by making profits. So obviously they're going to be promoting their drugs. And more often than not, we sometimes have drug company representatives visiting us at general practice, advertising and trying to promote their new drug. But according to UK practice, we have to abide by the NICE guidance, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. So this is a body which approves certain medications because it's gone through vigorous testing, it's gone through vigorous trials. We know the safety profile and the efficacy of such medications. So it's really, really important that we abide by these. Now, obviously, they are very, very harmful. And I think a lot of patients don't tend to understand their addictive nature. So, for example, if I have a patient coming to me, let's say they've had a hip operation, then it's perfectly fine for me to prescribe an opioid, but I have to make it 100% clear during the consultation that this is very addictive, and eventually I'll have to wean them off this medication. After all, it is a controlled drug. So there's only a limited amount of supply and a limited amount of tablets that I can give within a certain period of time. And it's really, really important to monitor these patients on a regular basis, because unfortunately, the internet it's not very well regulated, and we have a lot of pharmaceutical companies selling lots of opioids online, and it's ultimately incredibly dangerous. And actually, there was a report by the BBC a couple of years ago which found that some pharmacies in London, some pharmacists were illegally dispensing morphine to individuals. And obviously these individuals are incredibly vulnerable. So it's all about making sure that safeguards are in place.
Right. And Professor Johnston, taking that point to you, that safeguards need to be in place, what protections need to be placed for the people, and what needs to be done to regulate these powerful companies that have so many profits, that can promote their product, can spend it on marketing?
Well, Dr. Saleem makes the really good point that as a general practitioner and as a doctor who controls what the patients get or who dispenses the drug in the first instance, she has a very important role to play. And clearly she's doing it. And also in the UK, we don't have quite the same influence as we do in the States in terms of a profit motive for our doctors. So it's perhaps easier here. But I was talking this morning with one of my colleagues about the issue in the States, and apparently it's very easy to get a prescription from a doctor in the States and fill it in 2 or 3 different pharmacies, the same prescription. And therefore, the patient is actually taking or not allowing the doctor to take responsibility. They're not taking responsibility for themselves. And that's why I say it's important that it isn't just, you can't blame it on one of the players in this. You need to think about personal responsibility, and you need to think as a patient, you've been warned by the likes of Dr. Saleem that these are dangerous drugs and you need to be careful with them. And then if you go and circumvent the advice of your doctor or ignore the advice of your doctor and you buy online or you take it from friends or relatives and you start taking these drugs, you will have problems. You need to listen to your doctor.
But Professor Johnston, in order to make this process more clear, how important are awareness campaigns and governments dedicating research to all of this in order to make sure that all the facts that are being put out are backed up by science, the information is promoted?
Well, there's a massive amount of information about this out there, and this is not an unpublicized epidemic of deaths in the States in particular. There's been a lot of publications about it, not in the scientific, well, in the scientific publications too, but in the daily press. And programs like your own that we're talking on now are important to try and elevate this issue and try and get patients to understand that taking too many of these drugs is potentially dangerous.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Professor Atholl Johnston, for joining us from London, and thank you, Sonya Saleem, for joining us and talking to us also from London. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.